January, 1885. The wind across the Nebraska plains had no opinion. It did not hate the woman standing beside the mud-walled house, it simply did not acknowledge her existence. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that pressed in from all sides, seeking the thinnest part of her wool shawl, the smallest gap between her worn leather boots and the frozen earth. Her name was Martha Reed, and her hands were raw inside her mittens, the skin cracked from a season of mixing mud and straw. The structure beside her was her own work. It was low and thick and had no beauty in it. The man on the horse, Mr. Abernathy from the town council, did not have to feel the cold. His coat was thick with buffalo fur. He looked at her house, then at her, his face a mask of civic disapproval. He was the system, the voice of a world that had a specific place for a widow, and it was not here, on a plot of land her husband had bought, living in a shelter she had built with her own 2 hands. He stopped his horse a dozen yards away, as if the poverty might be contagious. Then he delivered the truth as he saw it, the words freezing in the air between them. A woman alone has no business owning land. You will freeze in that mud hovel before the ground thaws. He did not wait for a reply. He simply turned his horse and rode back toward the distant, smoking chimneys of Prairie Ridge. Martha watched him go. She pulled the shawl tighter and laid a hand on the wall of her home. It was cold to the touch, but it was a solid cold. A quiet cold. It was not the biting, invasive cold of the wind. It was the cold of the earth, deep and patient. And inside that wall, mixed with the prairie grass and the sand, was a seam of dense, blue clay she had found by the creek, a secret the land had given her. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the walls that waited for the storm. Martha Reed had not come to the plains to be a widow. She had come with her husband, Jacob, a man whose lungs had been damaged by the coal dust of Pennsylvania. He had read pamphlets about the clean, dry air of the West, about land that could be had for the price of hard work. They arrived with little more than a wagon, 2 mules, and a shared belief that a person could build a life out of sheer will. Jacob was a quiet man, but he was not a strong one. The prairie air was clean, but it was also thin and cold. The work was harder than the pamphlets had described. He lasted 2 years. He left her with the deed to 40 acres of unforgiving land and a cough that the wind seemed to carry away on the day he died. The town of Prairie Ridge was a collection of wooden buildings, a testament to ambition and freshly sawn lumber. Its citizens believed in God, commerce, and the self-evident superiority of a clapboard house. A widow was a disruption to this order. She was a loose thread in the social fabric, a responsibility to be managed. The church ladies brought casseroles and pity. The town council, led by Abernathy, offered advice. They suggested she sell the land. They had a buyer in mind, a man with the capital to truly make something of it. They offered her a room at the boarding house, a respectable position mending clothes for the town's more prosperous families. It was not a cruel offer. In their eyes, it was charity. It was sensible. But Martha had a different kind of sense. She had spent 2 years watching the land. She did not see an empty expanse to be conquered. She saw a complex system. She saw how the prairie dogs built their towns below the frost line, how the entrances were angled away from the prevailing wind. She watched the wasps build their nests from mud and saliva, creating structures that were light and strong and held the day's heat long after the sun had set. She read the almanacs that Jacob had brought, not for the planting dates, but for the articles on soil types, on the insulating properties of sod, on the way the deep earth held a constant, cool temperature. Her defining habit was not prayer or needlepoint. It was observation. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable. She asked the carpenter why he built the walls of his houses so thin, with only wood to stop a winter wind that could strip paint from a wagon. He told her that was how houses were built. She asked the preacher why God would make a man strong enough to fell a tree, but not wise enough to see that the earth itself was a better shelter. The preacher told her that pride was a sin. Her questions were not meant to be rude. They were simply good questions, and the world of men had no patience for them. The rejection, when it came, was systemic. It was not one man's anger, it was the quiet, grinding machinery of a world that had no category for her. She went to the bank for a small loan, enough for lumber to build a simple, one-room cabin as Jacob had planned. The banker, a man who attended church with Mr. Abernathy, explained the rules. A loan required a guarantor, a husband, a father, a brother. A woman alone was not a sound investment. Her land was collateral, but her labor was not. She was dismissed not with malice, but with a ledger book and a regretful smile. This was the moment she was truly cast out. The town had offered her its designated place, and she had refused it. Now, the town was refusing her the tools to build a place of her own. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, saw her walking back from the bank, her face set. She stopped Martha on the boardwalk. "It's not natural," she said, her voice a mixture of concern and judgment. "A woman living in the dirt like an animal. Decent folk live in wood houses." That evening, Martha did not weep. She walked to the creek that cut through the corner of her property. She knelt and dug her hands into the bank. The topsoil was dark and loose, but a foot down, the earth changed. It became dense, heavy, and cool. It was mud. It was dirt. But it was hers. The bank would not give her a loan for wood. The town would not give her a place of her own making. But the land would give her this. The world had made its decision about her. Now, she would make hers. She would build with what she had. She would build a house of mud. The work nearly broke her. Summer bled into a dry, hot autumn, and every day was a battle against her own body. She began by digging a shallow foundation, a foot deep, which she filled with rocks hauled from the creek bed. This was the driest part of the work, and the easiest. The real labor began with the walls. She needed a form, a mold to hold the mud as it dried. Jacob's wagon, its axle broken beyond repair, became her lumber yard. She spent a week dismantling it, her hands bleeding from splinters, prying boards loose with a rusted tire iron. She built 2 parallel frames, 3 feet tall and 8 feet long, held together with scraps of rope. This wooden form was the vessel. The substance was the earth itself. She dug buckets of soil, hauled them 50 yards to a pit she had lined with the wagon's canvas top. She added water from the creek, carried in 2 pails on a shoulder yoke that Jacob had made. The yoke bit into her shoulders, leaving deep, purple bruises. Then she added prairie grass, armloads of it, mown with a small hand scythe until her back screamed in protest. The mixing was the worst part. She had no mule to circle and stomp. She had only her own 2 feet. She would gather her skirts and step into the pit, the cold, wet mud sucking at her ankles. For hours, she would tread back and forth, her feet and legs burning with the effort, until the mixture was the consistency of thick dough. Her fingers went from sore to raw to numb. The alkali in the soil leached the oils from her skin, leaving it cracked and bleeding. At night, she would rub them with tallow, but by morning the pain was back. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her diet was simple and meager, cornmeal mush, the occasional rabbit she managed to snare, and a bitter tea made from yarrow. There were days she would work from sunup to sundown and manage to fill and pack only a single 8-foot section of the wall. She would move the wooden form, set it up for the next day, and collapse onto her straw pallet in the half-finished structure, too tired to eat. The dizziness was a constant companion. Sometimes, when she stood up too quickly, the world would go dark at the edges, and she would have to brace herself against the damp, unfinished wall, waiting for it to pass. One night in late October, a hard frost arrived early. The wind found its way through the gaps in the roof she had yet to finish. She lay in the dark, shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. This was not the productive shivering that generates warmth. This was the final, desperate tremor of a body losing its fight with the cold. She thought of the town. She could almost smell the stew simmering on the stove in the boarding house kitchen. She could feel the radiant heat of the pot-bellied stove in the common room, see the yellow lamplight on the faces of the other boarders. They would be warm. They would be fed. Abernathy's words came back to her. You will freeze in that mud hovel." She pulled her thin blanket tighter and considered whether this was where her story ended. She had been stubborn, and the price of that stubbornness was to die alone in a house made of dirt. She considered giving up. She could walk to town in the morning, knock on the preacher's door, and accept their charity. But something pulled her back. It was not a prayer. It was not a memory of Jacob's encouraging words. It was a sentence from a tattered pamphlet on Roman architecture she had read by candlelight weeks before. The enemy of rammed earth is not cold, but water. A dry wall is a warm wall. The thought was a lifeline. Her mind, given a practical problem, let go of despair. The northwest wall, the one that took the brunt of the wind, was still weeping moisture from a rainstorm 2 weeks prior. The problem was not the cold. The problem was the water. The problem was the mud itself. The next morning, she did not walk to town. She walked to the creek. She did not go for water. She went for answers. She walked past the place where she had been digging, further down toward a bend where the buffalo used to wallow. There, the bank was different. The soil was not the rich, brown loam of the prairie. It was a dense, heavy gray-blue. She had noticed it before but had dismissed it as too heavy to haul. Now, she looked at it with new eyes. She dug her fingers into it. It was cool and smooth, almost greasy to the touch. It held its shape. She remembered watching the water after a storm, how it beaded on the surface of this clay, refusing to sink in. She had seen the buffalo roll in it, coating their hides before a storm. The animals knew. This was the discovery. It was not a cave, or a spring, or an abandoned cabin. It was a gift from the land, a secret hidden in plain sight. The town bank had refused her the money for wood. But the creek bank offered her something better. This blue clay was different. It was less porous. It would not hold the water. A wall made of this would be a dry wall. Her emotional response was not one of tearful relief. It was recognition. She knelt in the cold mud, a clump of the blue clay in her hand. She squeezed it, and it did not crumble. It compacted. It was right. The texture, the weight, the color, it all felt like an answer to a question she had been asking for months. She sat there for a long time, on the cold ground by the creek, feeling a quiet, solid certainty settle into her bones. The work was not over. In fact, the hardest part was about to begin. She would have to tear down the damp sections of the wall and rebuild them. But now, she was no longer experimenting. Now, she knew. The change in material required a change in process. The blue clay was too dense to mix with her feet alone. She devised a new tool, a heavy post oak log, about 5 feet long, which she used as a tamper. The work became a rhythm of labor. Dig the clay. Haul the clay. Mix with sand and grass. Shovel the mixture into the wooden forms in 6-inch layers. And then, tamp. For hours, she would raise and drop the heavy log, the dull thud echoing across the empty prairie. It was grueling, bone-jarring work, but with each impact, she could feel the wall compacting, becoming something more than just mud. It became a kind of sedimentary rock of her own making. The walls grew, thick and solid, 2 feet at their base, tapering to 18 inches at the top. They were seamless and solid, with a strange, faint blue-gray hue in the afternoon light. She used the sharpened barrel hoop to scrape the interior walls until they were surprisingly smooth. For the roof, she laid a lattice of willow branches she cut from the creek bank, and on top of that, she placed thick squares of sod, grass side up. The windows were small, no larger than a book, to minimize heat loss. She had no glass, so she used parchment paper, scraped thin and rubbed with tallow until it was translucent. It did not offer a view, but it let in a dim, golden light. The door was her one small luxury, made from the last good planks of the wagon bed, hung on leather hinges. The first proof of her labor did not come from a crop, or a visitor, or a word of praise. It came from silence. In mid-November, the first true cold snap of the season arrived. For a week, the temperature did not rise above freezing. The wind howled, a constant, mournful sound that rattled the wooden houses in Prairie Ridge. Inside her sod house, the sound was different. The thick walls muffled the wind to a distant whisper. She built a small fire in her hearth, using dried buffalo chips she had collected all summer. The fire was not large, but it did not need to be. The heat did not escape. It radiated from the fire, and the walls held it. The air inside was not warm, but it was still. It was calm. It was not cold. This was the moment of proof. She walked to the north wall, the one facing the relentless wind. In a wooden house, this wall would have been an ice sheet, radiating cold into the room. She pressed her bare palm against the packed earth. It was cool, but it was a neutral coolness. It was not stealing her body's heat. It was simply there, a solid, 2-foot barrier between her and the killing wind. She could stand right next to it and feel no draft. The house was breathing. It was holding its own against the prairie. She had not built a hovel. She had built a fortress. Her first and only ally arrived not out of pity, but out of curiosity. His name was Samuel, a boy of 12 who the town considered slow. He was not slow. He was simply quiet, more interested in the patterns of a wasp's nest than the rules of a schoolyard game. He was an outcast in his own way. His mother, a member of the church sewing circle, sent him out to Martha's place with a bundle of old clothes. An act of charity meant more for the giver than the receiver. Samuel was supposed to drop the bundle and leave. He did not. He stood and stared at the house. He walked its perimeter. He touched the walls. He did not see an ugly mud hut. He saw what Martha had seen: a prairie dog's burrow, a wasp's nest, a buffalo wallow. He saw the logic of it. He looked at Martha, not with the pity she saw in the townspeople's eyes, but with a question in his. "Is it warm?" he asked. "It is," she said. From then on, he started appearing once or twice a week. He never announced his arrival. He would just be there, watching her work, and then quietly picking up a tool to help. He knew things she had not learned from books. He knew which grasses had the toughest fibers for binding the clay. He knew where the driest willow grew for the roof lattice. He showed her how to mix a slurry of fine clay and ash to plaster the inside of the chimney, making it draw better. He did not talk much, but he understood the work. In him, Martha found something she had not realized she was missing, someone who saw what she saw, who recognized that wisdom was not always found in a church or a bank, but sometimes in the earth itself. The community's skepticism remained absolute. Her house was a landmark of foolishness, a story told to children about the dangers of pride. Abernathy would ride past on his way to check his cattle and would pointedly look the other way. The preacher warned his congregation about building one's house on sand, or in this case, mud, a clear reference to Martha's folly. They were not waiting for her to fail. They were certain of it. The only question was when. The answer arrived in the second week of January, 1885. It came not as a gentle snow, but as a blizzard. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, turned a milky white in the space of an hour. The temperature dropped 20 degrees, then 30, then 40. The wind came, a solid wall of force that carried ice and snow so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet. It was the kind of storm that had no name yet, but would later be called a white hurricane. In Prairie Ridge, the wooden houses, symbols of prosperity and decency, began to fail. The wind, armed with ice particles, sandblasted the paint from their walls. It forced its way through every crack, around every window frame, under every door. Stoves that had been burning day and night could not keep up. The heat they produced was stolen by the wind as soon as it left the iron. The temperature inside the houses began to drop. Wood, which had seemed so strong and permanent, was revealed to be thin and porous. It was no match for the plains. The first to arrive at Martha's door was the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, with her 2 young children. Her husband was trying to keep their own fire from dying, but the house was already dangerously cold. She had wrapped the children in every blanket they owned, but their lips were blue. She stood at Martha's door, the wind tearing at her, shame and fear warring on her face. She who had warned Martha about living like an animal was now seeking shelter in her den. Martha did not hesitate. She opened the door, pulled them inside, and shut the solid planking against the storm. The wind howled outside, but inside, it was quiet. The small fire glowed. The air was cool, but it was a living cool, not the dead cold of their own home. She gave them hot yarrow tea and sat them on a bench near the hearth. Within a few hours, more came. A family of 4 whose roof had begun to buckle. The town blacksmith, a man whose hands were so calloused he had not felt the true cold until it began to creep up his arms. They came in small, desperate groups, guided by the dim, tallow-greased light of her window, the only light visible in the white chaos. Her house, once an object of scorn, was now a beacon. She organized them without ceremony. The children were placed closest to the fire. The adults sat along the walls. The house was crowded, bodies packed together, but their combined warmth added to the heat held by the thick, earthen walls. The structure was performing exactly as she had designed it. The enemy was the cold, and her walls were holding the line. The last to arrive was Abernathy. He came late on the second day of the storm, his wife and son with him. The fur on his greatcoat was stiff with ice. The certainty had been scoured from his face, leaving only a raw, desperate fear. He, the man who owned the largest, best-built house in town, stood at her door, a supplicant. His home had become an icebox. The firewood was nearly gone, and the stove was losing its battle. He looked at Martha, and for the first time, he did not see a foolish widow. He saw the person who held his family's life in her hands. The power had reversed completely, and the wind howled so loud that there was no need to speak of it. The highest point of Martha's success was not a moment of vindication. It was the quiet, steady warmth of a crowded room, the only safe place left on the frozen prairie. The storm raged for 3 days. Inside the mud house, 27 people from the town of Prairie Ridge huddled together and survived. Martha was not a host, she was a quartermaster. She rationed her small store of cornmeal and smoked rabbit. She melted snow for water. Her response to the crisis was entirely logistical. When Abernathy and his family stumbled through her door, she did not look at him with triumph or demand an apology. She looked past him, at his shivering wife and son, and asked a simple question. "How many are with you? Can the children walk?" She directed him to a space along the far wall, making room for his family among the others. She did not gloat. She did not preach. She did not mention his prophecy that she would freeze in her hovel. Her wisdom was not in her words, but in the thickness of her walls. The house itself was her only statement. Throughout the ordeal, she moved among the huddled families with a quiet competence, checking on the children, adding a precious buffalo chip to the fire, her face calm and unreadable. She was simply a person doing what needed to be done. When the wind finally died and the sun emerged, weak and white in a frozen sky, the townspeople emerged from her home into a world transformed. The landscape was a sea of white drifts, sculpted by the wind into alien shapes. Their own homes were silent, cold tombs, filled with fine, powdery snow that had blasted through the walls. They had survived, not because of their prosperity or their piety, but because of the stubbornness of a woman they had dismissed. The acknowledgement came slowly, and in pieces. It did not come with a town meeting or a plaque. It came in actions. A week after the storm, Abernathy returned. He did not knock. He left a heavy burlap sack on her doorstep. Inside was a 50-pound bag of flour, a cone of sugar, coffee, salt, and, wrapped carefully in an old blanket, 2 panes of real glass. There was no note. The glass was a practical admission of error. He had seen the dim light from her tallow parchment windows and understood their insufficiency. He was acknowledging that her house was not a temporary hovel, but a permanent dwelling worthy of improvement. It was an apology made of silica and ash, and it cost him something. Later that spring, as he was riding past, he saw her mixing a new batch of mud to build a small adjoining shed for her goats. He stopped his horse. He did not dismount. He watched her for a moment, then spoke, not to her, but to the wall she was building. "That blue clay," he said, his voice gruff. "It holds the heat." Martha did not stop her work. She plunged her hands into the mixture, her movement steady and sure. "Yes," she replied, her voice even. "The earth knows how to keep its own." It was not forgiveness. It was a statement of fact, an agreement on a shared observation. For a man like Abernathy, it was as close to a concession as he would ever come. Martha Reed lived in her house for another 30 years. She never remarried. She never grew wealthy. But she was never again seen as an outcast. Her home became a quiet landmark. People would point it out to travelers. "That's the soddy that saved the town." Samuel, the boy who had understood, became like a son to her. He never left the prairie. He learned her building methods, refining them, experimenting with different mixtures and roof designs. He grew into a man and became a builder, not of the flimsy wooden houses of Prairie Ridge, but of solid, earthen homes that respected the power of the wind and the cold. Martha's death was as quiet as her life. She died in the spring of 1915, sitting in a sturdy wooden chair Samuel had made for her. She was 81 years old. She was looking out one of the glass windows Abernathy had given her, a cup of chicory tea still warm on the table beside her. In her lap was a small leather pouch containing the seeds for her summer garden. Outside, the sound of a hammer could be heard. Samuel, now a man in his 40s with a family of his own, was repairing the roof of the goat shed. The work was continuing. She looked like a person who had just finished a long and satisfying book. Her legacy was not written in histories of the West. It was written in the earth. 2 other families built sod houses in the years after the blizzard. Samuel went on to build over a dozen more across the county, homes known for being warm in the winter and cool in the summer, homes that stood long after the wooden structures had been torn down or blown away. Her legacy was in the specific number, 27. 27 people who lived to have children and grandchildren because her house stood when theirs did not. Samuel buried her on a small rise overlooking the creek where she had found the blue clay. The headstone was a simple fieldstone, and on it, he carved a single sentence, "Martha Reed." She built a good house. Perhaps you have been told that your walls are ugly. That the thing you are building, the idea you are nurturing, does not look like what everyone else builds. You have been offered a respectable room in someone else's house, and you have quietly refused. So you stand outside the door to your own strange gift, mixing mud and straw, wondering if it is all foolishness. You wonder if the world is right, and you are wrong. What if the storm is coming for all of us? And what if your peculiar shelter, the one built from the very things you were told were worthless, is the only thing that was ever truly safe? Those thick mud walls, built from rejection and observation, became a refuge for the very people who had scorned them. The strongest shelters are often built from the materials the world throws away. If you believe quiet strength is still the most powerful force on earth, subscribe for more stories of the people history chose to forget.